Ethan Carter lost everything in the span of 12 minutes. He did not lose it to a fire, or a flood, or a sudden illness. He lost it in a glass conference room on the 31st floor, under lights that hummed too loudly, in front of people who had decided his fate before he ever sat down. The woman who signed the papers that ended his career was named Victoria Hale, and in 11 years of working for her company, he had never once spoken to her directly. She did not know the sound of his voice. She did not know he had 2 daughters. He raised alone after his wife passed away. She only knew a name on a spreadsheet. And on that gray autumn afternoon, the name was circled in red. 6 months later, instead of hiring a lawyer or nursing a grudge, Ethan spent every dollar he had saved to buy a broken-down diner off a quiet highway, hoping to build something smaller but real. He believed, with total certainty, that he would never see Victoria Hale again. Then, on a cold and rainy night at the edge of winter, her car died right outside his front door, and she walked in without the faintest idea that the man pouring her coffee was the man she had once erased with a single signature. The boardroom on the 31st floor had a view that made visitors forget why they were nervous. All steel and glass and a skyline that looked like it belonged to someone else's life. Victoria Hale sat at the head of the long table, spine straight, hands folded, the youngest chief executive the Hale Dining Group had ever appointed, and the only one who had to prove her worth every single quarter. Beside her sat Miles Grant, the company's vice president of operations, a man whose smile arrived a half-second before his words did, as though he had rehearsed both in a mirror. He opened a folder and began to speak, and his voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had already decided how the meeting would end. Revenue was down in 3 regions, he said, and something had to give, because the board did not tolerate soft quarters. Not this year, not with 2 competitors circling for acquisition. Someone senior would have to go, he continued. Someone whose division had underperformed long enough that the numbers could no longer be explained away. He placed a single sheet of paper in front of Victoria, and at the top of it was Ethan Carter's name. Victoria studied the page for exactly as long as it took to read it, which was not long at all. She did not ask who Ethan Carter was as a person, whether he had built 3 regional teams from nothing, whether he had once worked 18-hour days without complaint during a supply crisis that nearly sank the company. She did not ask if anyone had spoken with him, or given him a chance to explain the numbers Miles had laid so neatly across the table. She simply looked at the columns, the percentages, the tidy red arrows pointing downward, and she trusted the data the way she trusted very little else in her life. 12 minutes after the meeting began, she reached for a pen and signed her name beneath a decision that had already been made for her, though she did not yet understand that. Ethan was called upstairs an hour later, handed a folder of his own, and told, in language softened by human resources training, that his position had been eliminated effective immediately. He listened without interrupting. He did not raise his voice, and he did not ask for a second chance, because some part of him already understood there was no one in that room willing to give him one. He walked out of the building the way he had walked in every morning for 11 years, shoulders square, pace unhurried, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him crumble. At the front desk, he stopped, reached into his jacket, and unclipped the identification badge that had let him into that building since the year his wife was still alive to see him wear it. He set it gently on the marble counter, the way a man sets down something he once believed mattered more than it did. The receptionist, a young woman named Dana who had always liked him, opened her mouth to say something kind. But he only offered a small, tired smile and a single sentence before he turned toward the door. He said he hoped the numbers would treat the company better than the people ever had. Nobody stopped him, and nobody chased after him to ask what he meant. And by the time the words reached Victoria's office through a second-hand retelling, she had already moved on to the next item on her calendar, certain, in the quiet architecture of her own mind, that she had simply made the responsible choice. For a while, Ethan did nothing at all, and that nothing felt heavier than any of the busy years before it. He sat in his kitchen some mornings and stared at a coffee mug until it went cold, turning over 11 years in his mind, trying to locate the exact moment he had become disposable. His daughters were grown and building their own lives 2 states away. Proud of him in the way grown children are proud of parents from a comfortable distance. Unaware of how quiet the house had become, he filed a few applications out of obligation more than hope. Sat through interviews with men half his age, who used words like synergy and disruption, and came home each time feeling a little more like a stranger to the industry he had given his best years to. It was Martha, an old friend of his late wife who ran a diner 2 counties over, who finally said the thing nobody else had the nerve to say. She told him that a man with his hands and his heart didn't belong behind a desk waiting for permission. He belonged somewhere he could build something nobody could take from him with a single signature. That conversation stayed with Ethan longer than he expected it to, turning over in his mind through the following weeks like a stone smoothed by water. He began driving out past the edge of town on weekends, not entirely sure what he was looking for, until one gray afternoon, he passed a squat little building off the highway, with a sign so faded he could barely make out the word sunrise. The windows were fogged with dust, the parking lot cracked with weeds pushing through the asphalt, and a hand-painted note taped inside the glass door read simply, "For sale, ask inside." He parked without meaning to, and by the time he walked through that door, something in his chest had already made the decision his head hadn't caught up to yet. The old woman behind the counter turned out to be Martha herself, who had bought the diner decades earlier from its original owner and was finally ready to retire and move closer to her grandchildren. She looked at Ethan for a long moment, the way people do when they recognize something familiar in a stranger, and told him this place used to feed the whole town, back before the highway moved and the crowds thinned out. Everyone Ethan told about the purchase reacted the same way, with a pause, a careful glance, and some version of the same warning that buying a dying diner with his severance money was not a plan so much as a slow way to lose the rest of what he had. His old colleagues, the few who still returned his calls, suggested he wait for a better corporate opportunity instead of gambling on a building that looked like it belonged in a different decade. But Ethan had spent 11 years trusting other people's judgment about what mattered and where he belonged, and something about the peeling paint and the cracked vinyl booths of Sunrise Diner felt more honest than any conference room he had ever sat in. He signed the papers on a Tuesday in early autumn, and Martha handed him a set of keys that were heavier than they looked, warm from years of being carried in her apron pocket. She told him, before she drove off toward her daughter's house 3 states away, that the diner had good bones and a longer memory than most people gave it credit for. Ethan made 3 decisions before he ever flipped the sign to open, decisions that would come to define the next 6 months of his life. He would not take out a loan, because he refused to build something new on the same foundation of debt and pressure that had crushed him before. He would not bring in outside investors, because he had learned exactly what it felt like to answer to people who saw him as a line item rather than a person. And he would do the work himself, every bit of it, from the wiring to the paint to the menu, because for the first time in over a decade, there was no one left to tell him he was doing it wrong. He spent his mornings replacing rotted floorboards and his afternoons repainting the walls a warm, buttery yellow that reminded him of his mother's kitchen when he was a boy. By the time the first frost hit, Sunrise Diner had a working stove, a working heart, and a man behind the counter who finally recognized his own reflection in the window glass again. The town noticed slowly, the way small towns notice most things. In quiet observations, passed between neighbors at the hardware store and the post office. A retired mechanic named Walter became the diner's first regular, ordering the same plate of eggs and hash browns every morning, and leaving the same generous tip, as though he understood exactly how much that steady patronage meant. A young mother named Sarah started bringing her twins in on Saturday mornings, charmed by the fact that Ethan remembered their names and their orders without ever writing anything down. Word spread that the new owner didn't just cook food. He seemed to care whether people left feeling a little better than when they arrived. And in a town that had grown used to being an afterthought, that kind of attention felt almost radical. Ethan found himself smiling more often than he had in years. Not the practiced, professional smile he used to wear in boardrooms, but something looser and more honest. He still thought about the 12 minutes that had ended his old life, but less each week. the way a bruise fades from purple to yellow to nothing at all. The night everything changed arrived with a cold rain that had been building all afternoon. The kind of storm that turned the highway into a ribbon of reflected headlights and made every driver grip the wheel a little tighter. Victoria Hale was 3 hours outside the city, returning from a disastrous board meeting where 2 directors had questioned her leadership in front of the entire room. Their words polite, but their meaning unmistakable. She had wanted to drive alone that night, without a car service, without an assistant hovering nearby, just to feel like she still had control over something in her life. Somewhere past a bend in the road, her car's engine coughed twice and died completely, leaving her stranded on the shoulder with rain hammering the windshield and no cell signal to call for help. Through the blur of water on the glass, she noticed a soft yellow light glowing from a small building not far ahead, and against every instinct that told her to wait for a tow truck instead, she stepped out into the storm and walked toward it. Victoria pushed open the door of Sunrise Diner soaked to the skin, her tailored coat ruined, her carefully composed expression finally cracking under the weight of a night that refused to go her way. The bell above the door rang softly, and a man behind the counter looked up, his hands still moving through the familiar motion of wiping down a coffee machine. He recognized her instantly, the sharp cheekbones and the steady eyes that had once looked past him across a conference table, without truly seeing him at all. But Victoria did not recognize him, not even slightly, because, in her memory, he had only ever existed as a name on a page, never as a face attached to a voice or a life. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, an old ache mixed with something he hadn't expected, curiosity. And he made a choice in that instant that would shape everything that followed. He simply nodded toward an empty booth and told her to sit down before she caught a chill, his voice calm, giving away nothing of the storm quietly moving through him. She sank into the booth like a woman who hadn't allowed herself to stop moving in years, and for a moment, she simply stared at the checkered tablecloth, as though she had forgotten such simple things still existed in the world. Ethan brought her a mug of coffee without asking, and a few minutes later, a steaming bowl of soup, thick with vegetables and a broth he had been perfecting for weeks. Victoria took one spoonful, then another, and something in her shoulders finally loosened. The tension of the boardroom and the ruined car and the endless pressure of running a company slipping away with each bite. She told him, almost involuntarily, that she had eaten in some of the finest restaurants on 2 continents, and none of them had ever tasted like this. Ethan allowed himself a small smile and said that the secret wasn't a fancy technique. It was simply that nobody in this kitchen was trying to impress a critic, only trying to make someone feel cared for. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and a little surprised at herself, and outside the rain kept falling against the windows like it had nowhere else to be. They talked for nearly an hour while the storm passed, though neither of them mentioned names that mattered, or companies, or boardrooms, or anything that might have connected the dots between them. Victoria asked about the diner, and Ethan told her a simplified version of the truth, that he used to work in the restaurant industry and had decided to start something of his own after a difficult year. She asked what kind of restaurant industry, and he said the corporate kind, the kind with spreadsheets and quarterly targets, and left it exactly there, watching her face carefully for any flicker of recognition that never came. Victoria admitted, more openly than she intended, that she ran a company herself, though she kept the details vague, saying only that it was food-related, and that lately, it felt like nothing she did was ever quite enough for the people above her. Ethan listened without offering advice, without trying to solve anything, simply nodding in the places where nodding was needed, and Victoria found herself grateful for a kind of attention she hadn't received from anyone in years. When the tow truck finally arrived, she stood reluctantly, thanked him twice, and told him, without fully understanding why, that she would very much like to come back sometime. She did come back, first the following week, telling herself it was only because the food had been genuinely excellent, and she had a professional obligation to know good cooking when she found it. But one visit became 2, and 2 became a quiet, unspoken habit, until Victoria found herself driving the extra distance out to Sunrise Diner nearly every Thursday evening, long after her car had been repaired, and there was no practical reason left to return. It wasn't only the food that pulled her back. Though the food remained extraordinary, it was the low hum of jazz Ethan played from an old radio behind the counter, and the smell of fresh bread that seemed to live permanently in the walls. It was the particular quiet of a place that asked nothing of her, no performance, no strategy, no version of herself curated for a boardroom or a headline. Ethan, for his part, kept a careful distance, even as the visits became a comfortable rhythm between them, never once revealing who he had been before the diner, never mentioning the name of the company that used to employ him. He told himself it was simpler that way, that the past belonged in the past, and that Victoria seemed to need this small, quiet corner of the world more than she needed the truth of who was serving her coffee. Over the following weeks, their conversations deepened in the way conversations do between two people who have stopped performing for each other. Victoria began speaking more freely about the exhausting weight of running a company that never seemed to trust her fully, no matter how many quarters she delivered strong results. She confessed that she had clawed her way to the top of Hale Dining Group by working twice as hard as anyone around her, and that even now, board members twice her age spoke to her, as though she were still proving a point, rather than leading an organization. She said, quietly one evening, that she couldn't remember the last time someone in her life had wanted anything from her besides results. And Ethan felt the words land somewhere close to his own old wounds. He never offered pity, because pity wasn't what she needed. He simply refilled her coffee and let his presence say what words might have made awkward. Slowly, without either of them naming it, Victoria began to trust him in a way she trusted almost no one else in her carefully guarded life. And Ethan found himself caring for her in return, even as guilt sat quietly beneath every kind word he offered. There were quieter evenings too, ones that had nothing to do with confessions or crowded boardrooms, evenings that simply belonged to the two of them and the low hum of the diner settling around closing time. Victoria once stayed late helping him restock the pie case, sleeves pushed up, laughing at how badly she sliced a pumpkin pie despite years of eating in some of the finest restaurants in the country. Ethan taught her how to pull espresso the old way, guiding her hands over the machine with a patience that had nothing to do with correcting her, and everything to do with simply being near her a little longer. She told him, almost as an aside, that she couldn't remember the last time she had done something with her hands that didn't end in a report or a signature. He told her that was exactly why he had bought the place, because a life spent only signing things eventually stopped feeling like a life at all. Neither of them noticed how late it had gotten until the snow outside had already started collecting on the windowsill, soft and steady, indifferent to the two people who had quietly stopped watching the clock. The truth finally surfaced on an ordinary evening, the diner mostly empty, rain tapping lightly against the windows in a smaller echo of the storm that had first brought them together. Victoria had wandered toward the back hallway looking for the restroom, and paused in front of a small collection of framed photographs Ethan kept near an old employee bulletin board he hadn't yet taken down. One photograph showed a younger Ethan in a crisp uniform bearing a familiar crest, standing beside a plaque that read Employee of the Year, the name beneath it unmistakably his own. She recognized the crest before she recognized the face, because it was the same logo stitched onto every uniform in every restaurant beneath the Hale Dining Group banner, the company that bore her own family name. Her breath caught somewhere in her chest as the pieces assembled themselves with a terrible, quiet clarity. The diner owner, the calm voice, the careful silence about his past, all of it belonging to a man she had once dismissed in the span of 12 minutes. She walked back into the dining room holding the photograph, her hands trembling slightly, and asked him, in a voice barely above a whisper, why he had never told her the truth. Ethan set down the rag he had been using to while gal withel gryas without flinching, because some part of him had known this moment would eventually arrive. He told her simply that she had needed a quiet dinner more than she needed a difficult conversation, and that reopening old wounds had never seemed worth ruining the fragile peace they had built between them. Victoria stood frozen for a long moment, the photograph still in her hands, memories of that 12-minute meeting rushing back with a clarity she hadn't allowed herself in months. She remembered the folder Miles had placed in front of her, the tidy red numbers, the total absence of any question about the man behind the name she had signed away. Guilt rose in her chest like something physical, heavy and sharp, because she realized in that instant that she had spent weeks growing close to a man whose life she had once ended with barely a glance. She sat down slowly in the nearest booth. And for the first time since she had become chief executive, Victoria Hale did not know what to say. She left the diner that night without finishing her coffee. And for several days, she did not return, though her thoughts circled back to Ethan more often than she wanted to admit. Instead, she poured her restless energy into something she should have done 6 months earlier, quietly pulling the old personnel files related to Ethan's termination, the reports Miles had presented, the meeting minutes, the performance reviews that had supposedly justified letting him go. The deeper she read, the less sense any of it made. Figures that didn't align with the quarterly statements she remembered approving, timelines that contradicted themselves, or language in the reports that felt strangely rehearsed rather than factual. She discovered an email chain, buried and nearly deleted, showing that Ethan had formally objected months earlier to a cost-cutting plan that quietly substituted cheaper, lower-quality ingredients across several restaurant locations without informing customers. Ethan, it turned out, had refused to implement the plan in his division and had reported his concerns directly to senior leadership, concerns that were never passed along to Victoria in their original, unfiltered form. Instead, those concerns had been rewritten, softened, and eventually flipped entirely, until Ethan appeared not as the employee who raised an ethical red flag, but as the underperforming manager responsible for the division's decline. The name attached to every altered document, every convenient omission, every quietly vanished witness statement was the same name that had sat beside her in that boardroom, offering calm reassurance while she signed away a man's career. Miles Grant had built an elaborate, patient case against Ethan Carter, not because Ethan had failed the company, but because Ethan had refused to help him hide a decision that would have saved the company money while quietly cutting corners on quality and safety. Victoria remembered, with a fresh wave of nausea, how confidently Miles had presented the numbers that day, how he had never once suggested speaking with Ethan directly, how convenient it had been for him that she trusted data over people. She realized she had been used as a signature, a rubber stamp bearing her family's name, while a man who had actually tried to protect the company's integrity was quietly destroyed for getting in the way. The betrayal cut in two directions at once, toward Miles for his manipulation, and toward herself for having been so willing to sign a man's fate away without ever asking him a single question. That night, alone in her apartment overlooking a city that had never once made her feel at home, Victoria finally understood exactly how much damage 12 careless minutes could cause. She returned to Sunrise Diner the following evening, not for coffee, not for comfort, but to say the words she had been rehearsing the entire drive out. Ethan was closing up for the night when she walked in, and something in her posture told him immediately that this visit was different from all the ones before it. She told him everything she had found, the falsified reports, the buried emails, the careful architecture Miles had built to protect himself, while sacrificing someone who had only tried to do the right thing. Ethan listened in silence, his jaw tight, old anger surfacing in a way it hadn't in the 6 months since he had walked out of that glass building for the last time. When she finished, Victoria said she intended to bring the truth to the board, to correct the record publicly, regardless of what it might cost her personally within the company her family had built. Ethan studied her for a long moment, searching for any trace of performance in her expression, and found none, only the raw, unpolished sincerity of someone finally choosing honesty over convenience. The following weeks tested Victoria in ways her career never had, because confronting Miles Grant meant confronting an entire structure of power that had quietly protected him for years. When she brought her findings to the board, Miles did not simply defend himself, he counterattacked, deflecting attention from the falsified documents by raising questions about Victoria's judgment instead. He suggested, carefully and with practiced concern, that the chief executive's objectivity might be compromised by a personal relationship with a former employee, one she had reportedly been seen visiting at a diner outside the city. The insinuation spread quickly through the company and then beyond it, picked up by financial reporters hungry for a story about scandal inside a well-known family business. Within days, shares of Hale Dining Group dipped sharply, as analysts speculated about instability at the top, and Victoria found herself facing the exact kind of crisis she had spent her entire career trying to avoid. Miles, meanwhile, positioned himself publicly as the steady hand the company needed, the loyal executive protecting shareholder interests, while his chief executive was distracted by matters of the heart. Ethan watched the headlines with a growing unease, worried that his presence in Victoria's life had become a weapon being used against her, exactly the kind of collateral damage he had hoped to spare her from. One evening, as she sat exhausted in a corner booth of the diner after another brutal round of press calls, he gently suggested that perhaps it would be easier for everyone if she simply stopped coming around, at least until the storm passed. Victoria looked up at him with an intensity that startled him, and told him, in a voice that left no room for argument, that she was done letting other people's convenience dictate what she was willing to fight for. She said she wasn't doing any of this simply to protect him. Though she cared for him more than she had expected to, she was doing it because a wrong had been committed, and she intended to correct it regardless of what it cost her. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Victoria refused to retreat, refused to soften the truth to preserve someone else's comfort, refused to let fear of scandal outweigh her responsibility to be honest. It was, in its own quiet way, the bravest thing either of them had witnessed her do, and Ethan felt something in his chest shift permanently in that moment. While the corporate battle escalated in boardrooms and headlines, something gentler was taking root 100 miles away, entirely outside anyone's control or planning. News of the small diner behind the unfolding scandal had begun to spread on its own, not because of the controversy, but because people were curious about the man at the center of it, the one who had apparently walked away from a corporate career to build something honest with his own two hands. Strangers began driving in from neighboring towns just to see the place for themselves, drawn less by curiosity about the drama and more by something rarer, the promise of a meal served without pretense in a room that felt like it remembered how to care about people. Ethan never advertised, never offered discounts to lure in the curious, never leaned into the story swirling around him. He simply kept cooking the same honest food, the same honest way he always had. Lines began forming outside Sunrise Diner some mornings before he had even unlocked the door. Families and truckers and retirees standing patiently in the cold for a seat at one of his mismatched tables. Word of mouth, it turned out, traveled faster and further than any headline Miles Grant could manufacture, because people were hungry for something real, and Ethan had simply been offering it all along, quietly, long before anyone noticed. Among the strangers who began appearing at Sunrise Diner was a retired line cook named Harold, who had once worked alongside Ethan years earlier before their paths drifted apart, and who now offered to help on the busiest mornings without ever accepting a paycheck for it. A young woman named Claire, fresh out of culinary school and unable to find work in a city saturated with restaurants, showed up one afternoon and asked if she could simply watch him cook for an hour, and ended up staying for the rest of the season, learning more from his quiet discipline than she ever had from a classroom. Ethan never turned anyone away who wanted to learn, because he remembered too well what it felt like to be dismissed by someone who never bothered to ask what he was capable of. The diner slowly became something larger than a single owner behind a counter, a small, loosely stitched community of people who had each been overlooked somewhere else and had finally found a place willing to notice them. Even Walter, who had barely spoken a full sentence to anyone in years before Ethan opened the doors, started arriving early just to help set out chairs, content simply to be needed by something again. It was this quiet, accumulating warmth, more than any single act of kindness, that eventually convinced Victoria she was witnessing something worth protecting, not because it was profitable, but because it was rare. Victoria began contributing to the diner's growth in small, careful ways that she never once attached her name to. Arranging for a commercial kitchen supplier she trusted to quietly upgrade Ethan's aging equipment at cost, and connecting him with a contractor who repaired the diner's leaking roof before the worst of winter arrived. She never told him the full extent of what she had arranged, and when he thanked her for what he assumed were simple favors from an old industry contact, she let him believe exactly that, uncomfortable with the idea of being thanked for something that felt more like an apology than a gift. Watching the diner fill with genuine, unforced joy each evening did something to her that no boardroom victory ever had. It reminded her what all those quarterly reports and shareholder calls were supposedly in service of. In the first place, actual people, sharing actual meals, building actual community. She began spending less time thinking about market share and more time thinking about what kind of company she actually wanted to lead, questions she realized she had stopped asking herself years earlier. Ethan noticed the change in her too, the way her shoulders relaxed a little more each visit, the way her laughter came easier and stayed longer, the way she seemed to be rediscovering some quieter version of herself she had misplaced somewhere along the climb to the top. Neither of them said much about it directly, but both of them felt it. A slow and steady thawing that had nothing to do with the season outside. The final board meeting arrived on a bright, cold morning in early winter. The glass conference room filled almost to capacity as directors gathered to settle what had become the company's most public crisis in a decade. Victoria stood at the head of the table, the same table where Ethan's fate had once been decided in 12 careless minutes, and this time she came prepared with more than a single folder of curated numbers. She laid out the evidence methodically, the falsified reports, the deleted emails she had managed to recover, the sworn statement of a former employee who had finally agreed to speak about the pressure Miles had applied to alter his testimony. She did not raise her voice, and she did not perform outrage for the room. She simply presented the truth with the same steady discipline she had once used to defend decisions she now recognized as deeply flawed. Miles attempted to interrupt twice, his composure fraying for the first time anyone in that room had ever witnessed. But the weight of the evidence left him with nowhere left to retreat. By the time Victoria finished speaking, the room was silent in a way that felt entirely different from the silence that had once followed Ethan's dismissal. Heavier, more honest, impossible to walk away from unchanged. The board voted that same afternoon to remove Miles Grant from his position, effective immediately, citing gross misconduct and a pattern of deception that had cost the company both integrity and a talented employee it should never have lost. Several directors who had sat silently through Ethan's original termination now offered quiet, uncomfortable apologies, admitting they had trusted a polished presentation over the harder work of asking real questions. Victoria arranged for a formal offer to be extended to Ethan, inviting him back to the company at a senior executive level, with a salary and title far beyond anything he had held before his dismissal. She delivered the offer to him personally, sitting across from him in the same corner booth where she had once discovered his old photograph, watching his face carefully for a reaction she genuinely could not predict. Ethan considered the offer with the same quiet thoughtfulness he brought to everything. And after a long pause, he told her gently that he had no interest in returning to a place that had once decided his worth using nothing more than a spreadsheet. He said he had built something at Sunrise Diner that no boardroom could ever take from him again. And that particular kind of freedom mattered more to him now than any title ever could. Victoria absorbed his answer without argument, understanding it more fully than she might have 6 months earlier, back, before she had learned what it meant to build something with her own hands, instead of simply overseeing what others built. Before she left the diner that evening, she asked if she might address the full board one final time, not about business, but about something she felt she owed. Not just to Ethan, but to herself. Days later, standing once more in that same glass room, she looked out at the directors who had once approved Ethan's termination without a second thought, and she said the two words that had been sitting heavy in her chest for months. She said she was sorry, plainly, and without qualification, sorry for trusting numbers over people, sorry for mistaking speed for diligence, sorry for the 12 minutes that had cost a good man everything he had built. No one in the room spoke for a long moment afterward, because an apology like that, offered without excuse or self-protection, was not something any of them had witnessed from a chief executive before. It changed something quiet but permanent in how that boardroom operated from then on. A small, lasting reminder that decisions about people should never again be made without first knowing who those people actually were. Winter settled fully over the town not long after, blanketing the highway and the fields beyond it in a soft, steady white that made everything look a little more forgiving. Sunrise Diner glowed warmly against the early darkness each evening, its windows fogged with heat from the kitchen, its booths filled night after night with regulars who had come to think of the place as something closer to home than a restaurant. Victoria became one of those regulars in the truest sense, no longer arriving in tailored suits with a driver waiting outside, but in a simple coat and boots, sleeves rolled up more often than not, flour dusted across her forearms from an afternoon spent learning to bake alongside Ethan. The two of them developed a quiet rhythm together, closing the diner each night, wiping down the counters, counting the register, sharing a final cup of coffee before the lights went out and the world outside disappeared into snow and silence. There was no dramatic declaration of love between them, no grand gesture borrowed from a stage, only a steady accumulation of small kindnesses, shared silences, and the particular comfort of two people who had each been rebuilt by hardship and recognized that same rebuilding in the other. It was, in its own understated way, more romantic than anything either of them had experienced in the polished, performative years before it. Not long after the new year began, Victoria made a decision that startled the entire board, though by then, almost no one who knew her well was truly surprised. She announced her resignation as chief executive of Hale Dining Group, choosing instead to remain in the small town that had quietly rebuilt something in her she hadn't known was broken. With a portion of her considerable savings, she established a foundation dedicated to protecting small, family-run restaurants and diners from exactly the kind of careless corporate decisions that had once destroyed Ethan's career, offering legal support, fair review processes, and emergency funding to owners facing unjust treatment from larger companies. She told Ethan, one quiet evening, as snow fell steadily outside the diner's fogged windows, that she used to believe the most important thing a person could build was an empire, something vast and impressive enough to finally prove her worth to everyone who had ever doubted her. Ethan asked, gently, what she believed now instead, watching her face carefully in the warm light of the diner they had both come to love. Victoria looked around the room, at the regulars laughing over pie in a corner booth, at Walter nursing his evening coffee, at the fogged windows holding back the cold, and told him that now, she only wanted to build a place people always wanted to come back to. The final image of that winter belonged to both of them together, standing on a small stepladder outside the diner just after the season's first heavy snowfall, hanging a newly painted sign above the door where the old, faded one had been for so many years. The words were the same as they had always been, Sunrise Diner. But the paint was fresh, the letters clean and bright against the pale winter sky, catching the last light of the afternoon as it faded toward evening. Ethan held the ladder steady while Victoria secured the final bracket, her breath visible in the cold air, her laughter carrying easily across the empty parking lot in a way it never had in all her years running a company. When the sign was finally settled into place, they both stepped back to look at it together, snow gathering softly on their shoulders, the warm glow of the diner spilling out onto the pavement behind them. It was not the ending either of them had expected when a 12-minute meeting once tore their lives apart, but it was, in every way that mattered, the beginning they had both been quietly searching for all along. And as the first customers of the evening pulled into the lot, headlights cutting gently through the falling snow, Ethan and Victoria walked back inside together, ready to open the doors once more, to a place built not on numbers, but on the simple, stubborn belief that people deserved to be seen.